He thought he had everything figured out, but he never expected that one suitcase would change his life forever. Jack Whitmore stood on the porch of his sprawling ranch, the sun setting behind the hills, casting long shadows over the dusty land. The wind carried the faint smell of sagebrush and cattle, but there was something else in the air today. It wasn't just the typical evening breeze that Jack had grown used to over the years. No, this was different. Today, his mother, Magnolia Whitmore, had left. She had walked out of the house for the last time. Her figure had receded into the distance, small and fragile, carrying nothing but a worn suitcase that had once belonged to her late husband. Jack's eyes followed her as she disappeared over the horizon, the weight of the past 5 years hanging heavy in his chest. He had been patient, letting her live with him on the ranch, even though it wasn't the life he had chosen for himself. The demands of running a successful business, managing cattle, and dealing with the constant pressure of expansion had become too much. But there was something else. Jack could feel it, a bitter taste in his mouth when he thought about her leaving. She had been a reminder of a life he had left behind, one filled with family, love, and guilt. She wasn't supposed to leave. Not like this. Magnolia had been the one person who had always been there for him, but Jack had driven her away. She had never asked for much, just a little kindness, a little respect, but it was never enough for him. He had given her the bare minimum, hoping it would be enough to keep her quiet and out of his way. But today, it wasn't enough. She was gone. Jack felt the weight of his own actions pressing down on him. He had made a choice to cast her out, to force her to leave the very home that she had helped build. And now, she was gone. The sound of her footsteps faded into the wind, and Jack was left alone with the silence. It was the kind of silence that gnawed at you, that made you question everything. He glanced down at the suitcase, sitting quietly on the wooden porch. It was just an old, weathered suitcase, nothing special. But it carried more than just clothes and belongings. It carried the weight of a lifetime of choices, regrets, and secrets. Jack's hand hovered over the suitcase, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached down to unbuckle the leather straps. He didn't know why he felt compelled to open it. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was curiosity. But whatever it was, he couldn't stop himself. Slowly, he lifted the lid. Inside, there was nothing but a few pieces of clothing, some old photographs, and a letter. The letter was yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words written in Magnolia's neat handwriting. To my dear Jack, the letter began. If you're reading this, then I'm gone. I've kept this secret from you for years, not because I wanted to deceive you, but because I wanted to protect you. The ranch, the land, the cattle, they were never just ours. They belonged to your father, and to his father before him. But there's more, something that you need to know. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he read the next lines, the words seeming to blur before his eyes. The letter went on to explain that Magnolia had hidden something from him, something important. She had kept the family's true wealth a secret, not because of greed, but because she had wanted Jack to earn it on his own, to build his future without relying on the past. But now, the truth was out, and it was time for Jack to face what he had been avoiding for so long. Jack's mind raced as he read on, his pulse quickening. What was the secret? What had his mother been hiding all these years? He had always believed that everything he had was earned by his own hard work, but now he was starting to wonder if that was really true. The letter ended with a final sentence that hit Jack like a punch to the gut. What you'll find next is yours, but only if you're ready to accept it. Jack folded the letter and placed it back in the suitcase, his hands shaking. He couldn't believe what he had just read. The ranch, the land, the fortune, none of it had ever belonged to him alone. And now, he was faced with the consequences of his actions. His mother had left him with more than just a suitcase. She had left him with a legacy, one that Jack didn't know if he was ready to carry. The wind kicked up, and Jack stood there for a moment longer, staring at the suitcase, his mind spinning with the possibilities. What had he done? And what would he do now? He didn't have the answers, but one thing was certain. His life was about to change forever. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silver glow over the landscape as Jack Whitmore stood at the edge of the porch, staring out at the sprawling ranch he had worked so hard to build. The wind carried the scent of fresh earth and the distant cry of coyotes, but Jack's mind was far from the comfort of his familiar surroundings. His thoughts were consumed by the letter, the suitcase, and the truth that had been hidden from him for so long. The secrets his mother had kept, the wealth that he never knew existed, and the legacy he was now forced to confront, all of it weighed heavily on him. He could feel the weight of his past decisions pressing down on him, each one a reminder of how far he had strayed from the values his family once held dear. Jack had always believed in earning everything he had, in making his own way without relying on anyone else. But now, it seemed, that belief had been built on a lie. He wasn't entirely sure what to make of the discovery. The fortune that his mother had hidden, the wealth that had been passed down through generations, it was all suddenly in his hands. But it wasn't just about money. It was about the legacy of the Whitmore family, a legacy he had spent his entire life running from. He had never wanted to be tied down to the past, to the history of his family. But now, standing in the silence of the night, Jack knew that he could no longer avoid it. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. As Jack turned away from the porch, his gaze fell on the wooden box that had been left behind by his mother. The documents inside had revealed more than just financial secrets. They spoke of a history that had been carefully guarded, a history that Jack had never fully understood. Magnolia had kept him in the dark, not because she wanted to deceive him, but because she had believed that Jack needed to find his own way. She had wanted him to build something that was truly his, to create a future without the burden of the past. But now, with the weight of the box in his hands, Jack felt the weight of that decision. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the choices his mother had made for him, about the life she had hoped he would lead. But could he live up to those expectations? Could he truly carry the legacy of the Whitmore family, or would it crush him under its weight? Jack didn't have the answers. All he had was the knowledge that everything he thought he knew about his life was now in question. The ranch, the land, the cattle, it was all part of something bigger than he had ever imagined. The fortune his mother had kept hidden was only a small part of the story. There were deeper layers to the Whitmore family history, secrets that went beyond wealth and property. Jack had been too focused on his own success to see it, too wrapped up in his own ambitions to notice the ties that bound him to a past he had never fully embraced. And now, standing alone in the dark, he realized that the legacy of the Whitmore family was not something that could be ignored. It was a part of who he was, whether he liked it or not. As Jack walked back into the house, the door creaked on its hinges, a sound that seemed to echo in the empty space. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He moved toward the desk, where the letter and documents still lay, untouched. The weight of the decision before him seemed almost too much to bear. But Jack knew that he could not ignore it any longer. The choice was his to make. He could continue down the path he had been on, building his future on the foundation of his own hard work and determination. Or he could face the truth of his family's past, embrace the legacy that had been left to him, and find a way to honor it. But how could he possibly honor something he had spent so many years trying to escape? Jack sat down at the desk, his hand hovering over the papers. The weight of the decision was almost unbearable. The legacy of the Whitmore family was in his hands, and Jack didn't know if he was ready to carry it. But one thing was clear. The path forward would require more than just money or land. It would require something much deeper, something that Jack wasn't sure he had. As he stared at the papers before him, Jack realized that the real challenge wasn't about what he had inherited. It was about what he would do with it. He could continue to bury himself in his own ambitions, or he could face the truth and take responsibility for the legacy he had been given. The choice was his, but the burden was heavy. With a deep breath, Jack picked up the letter once more, his eyes scanning the words his mother had written. "You are ready, Jack. The legacy is yours, but only if you are willing to accept it." The weight of her words settled into his chest. Jack didn't know if he was ready, but he knew that there was no going back. The future of the Whitmore family rested in his hands, and Jack was about to find out if he had what it took to carry it. Jack sat at his desk, the dim light of the flickering candle casting long shadows on the walls. The letter from his mother, Magnolia, still lay in front of him, its words echoing in his mind. He had spent hours reading it over and over again, trying to make sense of the truth that had been hidden from him for so long. The legacy, the family fortune, the history, none of it had been what he thought. Jack had always prided himself on building his own future, relying on nothing but his own strength and determination. But now, With the truth in his hands, he realized that his entire life had been shaped by something he never understood. He had always believed that his success was his alone. But now, the weight of the family's past pressed down on him. His mother had kept the truth hidden, not because she wanted to deceive him, but because she had believed Jack needed to earn it on his own. She had wanted him to succeed without the help of the past, without leaning on the wealth that had been passed down through the generations. But now that the past had come knocking, Jack wasn't sure if he was ready to face it. The legacy of the Whitmore family was more than just money and land. It was about honor, sacrifice, and the choices that defined who they were. Jack had spent so many years running from that legacy, but now it was unavoidable. It was a part of him, whether he wanted it or not. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth offering a small comfort against the cold that had settled in the house. Jack stood up, pacing the room as he thought about what his next move should be. The ranch, the land, the fortune, none of it had come easily. But what he had built was his. Or was it? Was it truly his? Or had he just been living a lie? The more Jack thought about it, the more the weight of the truth seemed to grow. Magnolia had wanted him to earn everything, to make his own way, but in doing so, she had kept him in the dark. She had kept him from the truth. Jack ran a hand through his hair, frustration boiling inside him. He didn't know what to do. The letter had told him that the legacy was his, but it had also warned him that it wasn't just about the wealth. It was about the responsibility that came with it. And Jack wasn't sure he was ready for that responsibility. The Whitmore name carried weight, and with that weight came expectations. Magnolia had hoped Jack would carry those expectations with honor, but he wasn't sure if he could. He had spent so many years focused on his own success, on building his future, that he had never stopped to think about the past. The past that had shaped him, the past that had given him everything he had. Now, with the suitcase and the letter, Jack had a choice to make. He could continue to bury himself in his work, to focus on what he had built on his own. Or he could confront the legacy that had been left to him, a legacy that he wasn't sure he was ready to carry. As Jack stared out the window at the vast expanse of the ranch, he knew that the decision wasn't just about wealth or property. It was about something much deeper. It was about who he was and who he wanted to become. For the first time in his life, Jack realized that success wasn't just about what he had achieved. It was about the choices he made, the responsibility he took on, and the legacy he left behind. The moon hung high in the sky, its light casting a soft glow on the land. Jack turned away from the window and walked back to the desk, his mind made up. He knew what he had to do. The truth had come to light, and now it was time to face it. Jack reached for the letter once more, his fingers trembling as he held it in his hands. The family legacy was his, but it wasn't just about taking what was given to him. It was about honoring the past and making the right choices for the future. Jack Whitmore had spent his life running from his family's legacy, but now, he was ready to face it head-on. The choice was his, and he was going to make it count. Jack walked across the porch, the moonlight catching the edges of his boots as he took slow, deliberate steps. His mind was still reeling from everything that had happened. The letter, the suitcase, the truth of his family's legacy. It was all too much to process in a single night. But something in his heart told him that he could not put it off any longer. He had spent too many years trying to bury his past, and now, the past was demanding his attention. The fire in the hearth crackled behind him, the only sound in the quiet of the house. Jack paused and glanced down at the documents that lay on the desk. The words from his mother's letter still echoed in his mind. The legacy is yours, but only if you are willing to accept it. He wasn't sure what he had expected when he first read the letter, but it certainly hadn't been this. He had imagined a fortune, a sum of money that would change everything. But what he had found was something deeper, something more complex. The true legacy of the Whitmore family was not just wealth. It was about responsibility, about living up to the expectations of those who had come before him. Jack had been so focused on his own ambitions, so driven by the need to prove himself, that he had never taken the time to consider what his family's legacy truly meant. It wasn't about the land or the cattle. It was about the choices they had made, the sacrifices they had endured, and the honor they had fought to uphold. As Jack stood in the silence of the room, he realized that he was standing at a crossroads. He had the opportunity to embrace this legacy, to step into the role his mother had hoped he would take. But it was a heavy burden, one that would require more than just the wealth he had inherited. It would require him to confront his past, to face the mistakes he had made, and to rebuild the trust he had lost. It would require him to be the man his family had hoped he would become. Jack's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. He turned, startled by the sudden sound. It was late, and no one ever came by at this hour. Slowly, he crossed the room and opened the door. Standing on the porch was Rory Matthews, a loyal worker on the ranch, his face etched with concern. "Jack, is everything all right?" Rory asked, his voice gentle but firm. Jack hesitated for a moment before stepping aside to let Rory in. "I'm not sure," Jack replied, his voice sounding distant, even to his own ears. Rory stepped into the room, his eyes immediately falling on the open suitcase and the scattered papers on the desk. He didn't need to ask what was going on. "It's a lot to take in," Rory said softly, his gaze never leaving the documents. "But you don't have to face it alone. You've got people here who care about you." Jack looked at Rory, his heart heavy with gratitude. He had always been a solitary man, preferring to deal with his problems on his own. But in that moment, he realized that he didn't have to do this alone. He had a community, a family, whether he wanted to accept it or not. "I don't know what to do," Jack admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "This legacy, it's more than I ever expected." Rory nodded, understanding the weight of the situation. "The legacy isn't just about money, Jack. It's about what you choose to do with it. You've got the power to make things right, to rebuild what's been broken." Jack took a deep breath, letting Rory's words sink in. He had always been afraid of what the legacy represented. But now, standing there with Rory, he realized that it wasn't something to be feared. It was something to be embraced. "I think I'm ready," Jack said quietly, his voice steadier than before. "I think I'm ready to face what I've been running from." Rory gave a small, approving nod. "Then you're already on the right path." Jack turned back to the desk, his hand resting on the edge of the suitcase. It was time to make a decision. He couldn't keep running from the past, from the legacy that had been handed down to him. It was time to confront it head-on, to honor the sacrifices that had been made for him, and to build a future that was worthy of the Whitmore name. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, Jack felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing. It was time to step into his role, to take responsibility for the legacy that was now his to carry. The morning sun rose slowly over the ranch, casting a warm, golden light over the fields. Jack Whitmore stood at the window, his hands resting on the cool wooden sill, his mind still racing from the events of the night before. It was hard to believe that just a few days ago, everything had seemed so clear. Now, with the weight of his family's legacy pressing down on him, Jack felt more uncertain than ever. He had made the decision to face the truth, to confront the past he had spent so many years running from. But as he stood there, staring out over the land he had worked so hard to build, he wasn't sure where to begin. The legacy wasn't just about money or land. It was about understanding the choices that had been made before him, about honoring the sacrifices that had come before his own. Magnolia, his mother, had kept so much from him, and now, with the letter in hand, Jack realized just how much he had missed. The fortune, the family's history, the responsibility. It was all his now, but the question remained. Could he live up to it? Could he become the man his family had hoped he would be? Jack pushed himself away from the window and turned toward the desk. The suitcase, the letter, the documents, they were all still there, waiting for him to make a move. Slowly, he sat down and began to sift through the papers once more. He had already read the letter a dozen times, but each time he read it, it felt as if he discovered something new. The words his mother had written were filled with love, but also with a quiet sense of expectation. She had wanted him to earn his place in the world, to prove that he could stand on his own. But now, as Jack read through the papers, he realized that the legacy wasn't just about earning his place. It was about embracing the responsibility that came with it. Magnolia had hidden the truth from him because she had believed that he needed to find his own path, to learn the hard lessons that life had to offer. But now that the path was laid before him, Jack wasn't sure if he was ready to walk it. As he sat at the desk, lost in thought, there was a knock at the door. Jack looked up, startled by the sound. It was early, and he wasn't expecting anyone. He stood up and walked to the door, opening it slowly. There, standing in the doorway, was Rory Matthews. "Jack," Rory said quietly, his expression serious. I've been thinking about what you said last night. Jack nodded, gesturing for Rory to come inside. I don't know what to do, Jack confessed, his voice heavy with uncertainty. This legacy, it's too much. I don't know if I'm ready for it. Rory stepped into the room, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. You don't have to have all the answers right now, Rory said, his voice calm and reassuring. You just need to take one step at a time. Jack sat back down at the desk, running his hand through his hair. I spent so many years thinking that I could do it all on my own. I thought I could build everything from scratch, that I didn't need anyone. But now I'm realizing that. Maybe I was wrong. Rory walked over to the window, looking out at the land. It's not about doing it all alone. It's about understanding where you come from and using that to build something better. Your family's legacy isn't a burden, Jack. It's a gift, but it's up to you to decide how to use it. Jack stared at Rory, the weight of his words sinking in. Rory was right. The legacy wasn't something to fear. It was a chance to build something meaningful, to honor the sacrifices of the past while creating a future that was worthy of the Whitmore name. Jack took a deep breath, feeling a sense of clarity wash over him. For the first time in days, he felt like he could see a way forward. You're right, Jack said, his voice steady. It's time to stop running from the past. I have a responsibility to this land, to this family, and I'm not going to let it slip away. Rory smiled, a look of pride crossing his face. That's the Jack Whitmore I know, he said, clapping him on the shoulder. Jack stood up, feeling a sense of resolve take root in his chest. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face it. He had a family to honor, a legacy to uphold, and a future to build. Jack Whitmore wasn't sure what the next chapter of his life would bring, but for the first time in years, he was ready to embrace it with open arms. Jack stood at the edge of the ranch, his gaze sweeping over the fields that stretched out before him. The land he had worked so hard to build, to claim as his own, now seemed like a distant memory. Everything felt different. The weight of the letter, the suitcase, and the legacy of his family was pressing down on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had made the decision to face the truth, to embrace the past that had shaped him, but now, standing there in the quiet morning light, he was unsure of what came next. He had spent years building his life, his future, but the truth of his family's history had always been just out of reach. Magnolia had kept that history hidden from him, not because she wanted to deceive him, but because she had believed Jack needed to make his own way. And now that the truth was in his hands, he realized that the road ahead wasn't as simple as he had once thought. He had a choice to make, but it wasn't just about the land or the fortune. It was about the legacy of the Whitmore family and what he would do with it. Jack had spent so many years running from the past, from the responsibilities that came with the name he carried. But now, the past was no longer something he could ignore. He had inherited more than just a ranch. He had inherited the choices of those who came before him, the mistakes, the sacrifices, and the hopes that had been placed on him. He could feel the weight of it, the pressure to live up to something he wasn't sure he understood. The sun was climbing higher in the sky, the heat of the day beginning to settle in. Jack turned and walked back to the house, his boots crunching against the gravel path. His thoughts were still clouded, but one thing was clear. He couldn't continue like this. He had to face the future, whether he was ready for it or not. Inside the house, the quiet was almost suffocating. Jack walked into the main room and sat down at the desk, the papers from his mother's suitcase still scattered across it. The letter, the documents, it was all right there in front of him, waiting for him to make sense of it. He reached for the letter once more, his fingers brushing the worn paper as he unfolded it. It was the same letter he had read a dozen times, but now, with the weight of the decision looming over him, the words seemed to take on new meaning. The legacy is yours, Jack, but only if you are willing to accept it. The words felt different now. They weren't just a statement of fact. They were a challenge, a call to action. Jack had always thought that he could do it on his own, that he didn't need anyone or anything. But now, he realized that the truth was more complicated. He couldn't ignore the past. He couldn't build a future without acknowledging what had come before him. As Jack sat there, the silence around him seemed to grow heavier. He could feel the weight of the legacy, of the choices that had been made for him, and for the first time, he understood the full impact of those choices. The legacy wasn't just about what he had inherited. It was about what he would do with it. Jack knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There would be difficult decisions, hard choices, and moments of doubt. But he was no longer running from it. He was ready to face it head on. The ranch, the land, the fortune, it wasn't just about wealth. It was about responsibility. And Jack knew that he had a responsibility to the family that had come before him. He couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future. And for the first time, Jack felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life. It wasn't about proving something to anyone else. It was about proving something to himself. He had the power to make a difference, to honor the legacy that had been passed down to him. And that was a responsibility he was ready to take on. The sun had set behind the hills, casting a deep orange glow across the sky as Jack Whitmore stood at the edge of his ranch, looking out over the land that had been passed down through generations. The weight of the decision he had made earlier that day still lingered in his chest. He had chosen to embrace the legacy of his family, to take responsibility for what had been handed to him. It was not an easy choice, but it felt right. For the first time in years, Jack felt a sense of clarity, a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life. As the night began to settle in, Jack felt the weight of the legacy pressing down on him, but it was no longer a burden. It was a reminder of everything that had been sacrificed, everything that had been built, and everything that still needed to be done. He could no longer run from his past. The ranch, the land, the history, it was all part of him now. He had to honor that history, not just for his family, but for himself. He could feel the presence of his mother, Magnolia, beside him, as if she were watching over him, guiding him. The firelight flickered in the distance as Jack walked back to the house, his footsteps steady. And sure, inside, the room was warm, the smell of wood smoke filling the air. He moved to the desk where the papers still lay, the legacy of the Whitmore family scattered before him. He had already read the letter from his mother a dozen times, but each time it seemed to carry more weight. Her words were still fresh in his mind. The legacy is yours, Jack, but only if you are willing to accept it. Jack had accepted it. He had made the choice to face his family's past, to confront the truth that had been hidden from him for so long. It was time to move forward. The future was uncertain, but Jack knew that he was no longer alone. He had made peace with the past, and now he was ready to take the next step. There would be challenges ahead, no doubt. But Jack was ready to face them. He had the strength, the resolve, and the support of those around him. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was a road that Jack knew he had to walk. As the night grew darker, Jack sat down at the desk, his hands resting on the papers. The legacy of the Whitmore family was now his to carry, and Jack Whitmore was ready to do so with honor. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew that he would face it with courage. The fire crackled in the hearth, and Jack sat there, staring at the documents before him. It wasn't just about the land or the wealth. It was about the choices he would make, the legacy he would build, and the man he would become. He was ready. For the first time in his life, Jack felt truly ready to take on whatever came next. The morning air was crisp as Jack Whitmore stepped out onto the porch, the cool wind tugging at his shirt as he gazed out over the land. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light across the vast expanse of the ranch. The horizon stretched endlessly before him, but Jack didn't feel the weight of the land as he once had. Instead, he felt a sense of peace settle within him. The legacy that had haunted him for so long now felt like a part of him, something he could embrace and build upon. He had made his choice, and now it was time to move forward. The decision to accept the legacy was not easy. It had taken everything within him to confront the past, to face the truth that had been hidden for so long. But now, standing on the porch, Jack understood. His mother, Magnolia, had done what she thought was best. She had wanted him to stand on his own, to carve out his own place in the world, free from the shadow of the family fortune. But Jack realized now that he could carry the legacy without losing himself. He didn't need to abandon the ranch or his own dreams to honor the past. The two could coexist. The land he had worked so hard to build, the cattle he had raised with his own hands. This was his, but it was also a part of something bigger. His ancestors had worked this land long before him, and now, it was his turn to take up the mantle. He wasn't just a rancher. He was a part of a legacy that stretched back generations. Jack turned toward the house, a sense of resolve filling his chest. He had decisions to make, plans to set in motion. It wasn't just about managing the ranch anymore. It was about managing the responsibility that came with it. He had a duty to the land, to the people who depended on him, and to the Whitmore name. As Jack walked back inside, his boots echoing on the wooden floor, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The papers his mother had left behind still sat on the desk, waiting for him to take the next step. He knew there would be challenges, that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready. He had his own vision now. He would honor the legacy, but he would also forge his own path. He wasn't just inheriting a ranch or a fortune. He was inheriting the trust of those who had come before him, and it was up to him to prove he was worthy of that trust. Jack sat down at the desk, picking up the papers and sorting through them. There was still much to do, much to understand. But as he began to make plans for the future, he knew that he wasn't alone. He had the support of those who believed in him. Rory Matthews, who had been by his side through thick and thin, was already making preparations for the upcoming months. Jack had always been a solitary man, but now, he realized that he didn't have to do it all alone. His family, his team, together, they could build something that would last. Outside, the ranch seemed to stretch out forever, but Jack didn't feel overwhelmed. He felt empowered. The legacy he had once feared now felt like a foundation. He could build on it, grow it, make it his own. The land, the legacy, the future, it was all within his reach. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, Jack stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the fields and the cattle grazing in the distance. It wasn't just about what he had inherited. It was about what he would create. And for the first time, Jack Whitmore was ready to take on the challenge. Jack stood by the window, staring out at the sprawling ranch, his thoughts still tangled in the complexity of the legacy that had now become his responsibility. The papers scattered across the desk seemed to demand his attention, but for a moment, Jack allowed himself a pause. The decision to accept his family's legacy had been made, but the true challenge had only just begun. As the land stretched out before him, Jack knew that it was no longer just about holding on to what was already there. It was about shaping something that would last. He had the power to create something meaningful, something worthy of the name Whitmore, and he was determined to do it. The weight of his ancestors' hopes rested heavily on his shoulders, but it was no longer something that intimidated him. It was a challenge, yes, but it was also an opportunity. Jack had always prided himself on his independence, on building his life without relying on anyone else. But now, with his family's legacy in his hands, he understood that true strength lay not just in standing alone, but in honoring the past and forging a future that would make his family proud. He turned away from the window, the soft glow of the morning sun filtering through the curtains. He had a lot to do. The ranch wasn't going to run itself, and there were decisions to be made. But as he crossed the room toward the desk, Jack felt a sense of purpose settle over him. The fear, the uncertainty that had clouded his thoughts in the past was gone. It had been replaced by a quiet resolve, a knowing that he was ready to step into the role he had inherited. The letter from his mother, the documents in the suitcase, they had all been pieces of a puzzle that Jack was now ready to put together. The legacy wasn't just about wealth or land. It was about the people who had lived on this land, the community that had supported the Whitmore family for generations. Jack wasn't just inheriting a fortune. He was inheriting the trust of those who had worked alongside his family, and the responsibility to continue that legacy with honor. As he sat down at the desk and began to sort through the papers, Jack thought about the future. He had his work cut out for him. There would be challenges, and there would be moments when the weight of his family's history would feel overwhelming. But Jack wasn't afraid anymore. He knew that the road ahead would require hard work, dedication, and, above all, a willingness to learn. He had spent so many years avoiding the responsibility that came with his family's name, but now that he had accepted it, he was ready to face whatever came next. Jack smiled to himself, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease. This was what he had been waiting for, an opportunity to prove not just to his family, but to himself, that he could carry the Whitmore name with pride. The ranch would thrive, not just because of the land or the money, but because Jack was ready to give it everything he had. He had the knowledge, the strength, and the will to build something that would last. And now, as he looked out at the land that was his to shape, Jack knew that he had made the right choice. The future was in his hands, and for the first time in years, he felt ready to take it on. The morning was quiet, the kind of stillness that made Jack Whitmore feel both grounded and unsettled at the same time. He stood on the porch again, his eyes tracing the same familiar horizon, but today, it felt different. The land before him was no longer just a place he had inherited. It had become something deeper, something he was now bound to protect and cultivate. His hands, calloused from years of work, felt the weight of the responsibility he had taken on, but there was also a sense of peace in knowing he had chosen to step up. The legacy of the Whitmore family was no longer a shadow he could run from. It was now part of his identity, and with it came choices that would shape the future of the ranch and the people who depended on it. Jack had spent the last several days going over the papers, the letters, and the history of his family that Magnolia had kept hidden from him for so long. She had wanted him to make his own way, to build something with his own hands. And in doing so, she had kept the past at arm's length, only revealing its true weight when the time was right. Now, that time had arrived, and Jack knew there was no turning back. It was not just about keeping the ranch running. It was about growing it, honoring it, and making decisions that would honor his family's legacy for years to come. As he walked down the steps of the porch and toward the barn, his thoughts turned to the workers, the men and women who had helped him build this place. They were his partners, not just employees. Jack had always been a man of action, focused on the task at hand, but now, he realized that it was just as important to lead with vision and respect. The work was hard, but it was the foundation of everything they had built. And as he reached the barn, he found Rory Matthews waiting for him, leaning against one of the wooden posts, a calm presence amidst the growing tasks that lay ahead. "Morning, Jack," Rory greeted him, a hint of respect in his voice. Jack nodded, taking in the sight of the ranch around them, now buzzing with early activity. The cattle were grazing nearby, the workers preparing the fields for the new season. It was all part of the rhythm of life on the ranch. "Morning, Rory," Jack replied, his voice steady. "I've been thinking a lot about what comes next. We've got a lot of work to do. More than just the land itself." Rory nodded, understanding without needing an explanation. "We're in this together," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You've got the land. We've got the hands to work it. But it's your call now, Jack. What's the plan?" Jack looked out at the fields, taking a deep breath. The decision to accept the legacy wasn't just about claiming ownership. It was about creating something that would stand the test of time. He had the power now to make a real difference, but it wasn't going to be easy. The road ahead was filled with uncertainty, but Jack was ready to face it. "We're going to make sure the ranch thrives," Jack said, his voice full of resolve. "But it's more than that. I want to expand, open up new opportunities for everyone here. It's about making sure that the Whitmore name isn't just remembered for the land we own, but for what we did with it." Rory smiled, a hint of approval in his eyes. "You're thinking long-term. That's the way to do it." Jack nodded, his gaze moving over the workers, the animals, and the land. "We'll start by improving our operations. I want to make sure we're prepared for the future, not just trying to survive day by day. We'll invest in the ranch, in the people who work here, and in the community around us." It was a long-term vision, one that Jack had never fully embraced before. But now it felt right. As he stood there, looking out over the land, Jack Whitmore knew that the future was his to shape. The choices he made today would ripple through the generations to come. And for the first time, he felt ready to carry that weight with pride. The days that followed felt like a new chapter for Jack Whitmore. The weight of his family's legacy, once a burden, now felt like a mantle he was ready to carry. As he walked through the ranch, he saw it through new eyes, eyes that recognized the history, the hard work, and the sacrifices that had been made for this land. But now, it was his turn to write the next part of the story. He had spent so many years focusing on the present, on making a living and building a future that was solely his own. But the truth was, his future had always been tied to this land, to the Whitmore name. The first step was making changes, but not just for the sake of change. Jack wanted to honor the past while preparing for the future. He worked closely with Rory Matthews, who had become more than just a trusted worker. He was now a partner in the vision Jack had for the ranch. Together, they began to implement new strategies, improving operations and ensuring that the ranch wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. They invested in better equipment, expanded the land's capacity to support cattle, and focused on sustainable practices that would ensure the ranch could endure for generations to come. Jack knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, there would be challenges, but he was prepared for them. He had the support of those around him, and more importantly, he had a clear sense of purpose. Every decision he made was about more than just increasing profits or making the ranch more efficient. It was about building a legacy that would outlast him, something that would honor the hard work of his ancestors and ensure that the Whitmore name would be remembered with respect. He continued to meet with the workers, getting to know them better and learning their stories. He wanted them to feel that they were a part of something bigger than just the daily grind. He wanted them to feel invested in the future of the ranch, in the legacy they were all helping to build. As the seasons passed, Jack's vision began to take shape. The ranch grew stronger, more sustainable, and more prosperous. The community around them took notice. People began to respect the Whitmore name again, not because of the wealth or land, but because of what Jack was doing with it. He wasn't just preserving the past, he was building something meaningful for the future. One evening, as the sun set over the ranch, Jack found himself standing in the same spot where he had stood so many times before. The land stretched out before him, the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance. But this time, it felt different. He didn't just see the land as something he owned. He saw it as something that was part of him, part of his family's legacy, and part of the future he was now creating. Jack knew that the road ahead would continue to be filled with challenges. But he also knew that he was no longer alone in this journey. He had a team behind him, a community that believed in what they were building together. And as the last rays of sunlight faded behind the hills, Jack Whitmore felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The legacy of the Whitmore family was now in his hands, and he was ready to carry it forward with pride, honor, and determination.